We have considered now the nutritive soul and the perceptive soul. And what we have seen is that, according to Aristotle, they are inseparable from the body. And they're inseparable because they are simply a functional organization of certain body parts. And so when we die, it's impossible for our power of sight or our power of digestion to continue on living. Now it's time to consider the rational part of the soul, which Aristotle sometimes calls the mind. He sometimes calls the thinking part of the soul. He sometimes calls the intellect. There's a variety of different terms that he uses, and there's a variety of translations for those terms. Um, he d- uh, his discussion of the mind in particular, of thinking in particular, and how exactly it works occurs in book 3 chapter 4 and book 3 chapter 5 of the De Anima. And what Aristotle, the way he structures his discussion here is by isolating two different aspects, or you might even think of them as parts of the mind. It's unclear if they're just aspects. It's unclear if they're parts. It's kind of unclear what exactly they are. But for our purposes, we can think of them as two kinds of aspects or parts of the mind. Um, the first people call the passive intellect. Aristotle himself never uses that phrase, but that's how everybody else refers to it. That's what he's discussing in book 3, chapter 4. In book 3, chapter 5, he then discusses the active intellect. Aristotle does use that phrase. And so these two kinds of parts of the mind are supposed to work in tandem in certain ways. And so that's why people call the part of the mind discussed in 3-4 the passive intellect, because it's supposed to contrast with what Aristotle calls the active intellect. All right, so he's going to discuss the mind by discussing these two parts of the mind and how they work and how they can generate thought. So let's turn first to the passive intellect. So his discussion in 3-4. In order to understand how Aristotle's thinking about the mind and the activity of this rational soul, it's important to understand how he conceives of thinking. When we think about something, what exactly is going on? In Aristotle's view, what is going on is that your mind is either receiving, if it's the kind of first time you're thinking about it, your mind is either receiving, or if it's something you've thought about before, it's already kind of in your mind in some sense, considering the form of the object. We've talked about forms of things, right? We've talked about the form of a frog, say, and I'm going to use that example in just a little bit. When you are thinking about frogs, your mind is considering the form of that object, of the frog. Your mind has received it, right? And so his idea is actually something like this. And something that we didn't read in book 2 of the De Anima, Aristotle goes on at length about how perception works. And his idea is that sensible things out there, like this frog, say, they kind of exude their form. And we have certain receptors in us, namely eyes, that can pick up the perceptible form of the frog. And so that form is exuded by the frog. It goes in through our eyes and then into our minds. Now, Aristotle gets very detailed and it gets very complicated. Aristotle gets very detailed about how exactly this process works. We're not going to worry about those details. There are similarities to things we've seen before with the divided line and the ascent to the cave. Aristotle conceives of this process as a kind of ascent to more fundamental and basic truths, in a sense, to, truer truths that have a greater share of the truth, that are more fundamental or basic or important, explanatory. We're not going to worry so much about it. The very basic idea, and we'll see this in the readings for a couple weeks when we read book 1 of the Metaphysics. The very basic idea is that you see the frog, there's this perceptible form, and then if you see enough frogs, you'll have a memory of it. And if you have enough memories, you'll get what Aristotle calls experience of it. And then from experience, this kind of mastery of the form of frog can arise. And that would be the intelligible form of the frog becoming present to the mind. That's not something that happens to everybody. That's something that's going to happen to your frog scientist. This intelligible form of the frog, the form of the frog that is really kind of structuring and organizing the frog, enabling it to live the particular kind of life it lives, right? That's the kind of thing that you need to go study frogs for 10 years to understand. And that makes a certain amount of sense, knowing what we now know about the form of natural organisms, right? It's the form of a natural organism is not merely its apparent shape, the froggy shape or whatever. It includes that, but also the kind of internal organization, the way that all of the materials of the frog are related to one another and how they all then generate the particular life activities of the frog. To understand all of that requires quite a bit of knowledge, quite a bit of experience with frogs. And that's Aristotle's idea. Okay. Now, so what can happen then? So the perceptible form of the frog goes in through your eyes, there in your brain, but then the frog, of course, goes away at some point, or you stop looking at frogs at some point. I would assume, and then we think about the frogs, right? And so now we have a guy thinking about the form of frog. Something like that. Let's say this is a frog scientist, right? And so they have the intelligible form of frog in their mind. They understand it. They understand how it all works. Aristotle's idea, and this idea ends up being hugely influential on what's called the philosophy of mind, on that field of philosophy going forward. His idea is that in thinking about something, the mind, in some very real sense, becomes that thing. The mind becomes the form of that thing. Your mind, so keep using the example of frog, your mind doesn't become an actual frog because there isn't the matter of the frog there in your mind, right? There aren't, at least I'd hope there aren't frog bones and frog kidneys and whatever else, right? You don't have the matter of frog in your mind. You have just the form. You have the form abstracted from the matter, right? And so there isn't an actual frog in your mind, but the form of the frog is actually in your mind. The very form that informs, Kermit jumping around out there, that very form comes to be present in your mind. That's Aristotle's view of cognition, or at least it comes to be present in the frog scientist's mind. Now, a crucial fact, and this is going to drive much of Aristotle's discussion of the mind. The mind can potentially think about anything. It can potentially think about everything. This is going to have considerable consequences for Aristotle, right? And there seems to be something intuitive and right about this. You can think about colors. You can think about smells. You can think about touches or whatever. You can't see smells. You can't smell colors. Putting things like synesthesia aside, and that's not even clearly a counterexample to Aristotle's claim here. So the mind is different from our senses in that everything is a potential object for the mind. And it's not just sensible things, but also non-sensible things like numbers or shapes, these kind of abstract realities. You can't see the number 2, not in its nature, not in its senses. You can see 2 things, but that's not the same as seeing the number 2, right? The mind can grasp that though, right? It's a similar point as to what we saw with Plato. And so the mind, in contrast to all the other kinds of faculties that we have, can think about anything. Anything is a potential object for it. Whereas for your eyes, only colors are potential objects for it, right? Something like that is Aristotle's idea. All right. So why is that so momentous of a claim, so momentous of a fact for Aristotle? Because what Aristotle claims is that if the mind can potentially think about anything, well, then the mind cannot be a body or have a bodily organ. What does it mean to have a bodily organ? What he's saying here stands in sharp contrast to things that you might think, or at the very least, things that you hear today. Aristotle is here denying that the brain is the bodily organ of the mind. I think that's probably how most people tend to think today, that the mind just is the brain, or the mind is somehow hooked up to the brain. The brain is a kind of organ for the mind in the same way that the eyes are the organ for sight, or something like that. Aristotle is denying that. The mind, and it's not just that actually the mind works through the heart or the spleen or something. No, there is no bodily organ at all for the mind. And it's this crucial fact that leads to this conclusion. Well, how so? Aristotle's argument is something like this. If the mind had an organ, such as the brain, well, that organ would impede the mind from thinking about certain things. If the mind had an organ, well, then the mind could not think about everything. There would be certain things that the mind could not think about if the mind had an organ, or if the mind were a body part, such as the brain. And since the mind can think about everything, well, it follows then that the mind must not have an organ, must not be a body part. But why think that the mind having an organ or being a body part would impede it from thinking about certain things? Aristotle is unfortunately somewhat terse here. He doesn't say a whole lot, but his idea seems to be something like the following. Let's take the brain as our example, right? Since that's what I think most people today would want to say, right? The brain seems to be the mind, or at the very least, the organ of the mind. And Aristotle is here denying that. He's arguing against that. Well, why can't the brain be the organ of the mind? Aristotle would say, based on what he says in 3.4, I think, he would say something like this. If the brain were the mind, or if the brain were the organ of the mind, in the same way that the eyeball is the organ for sight, right? If the brain were the organ of the mind, well, then, because the brain has certain properties, right? And so, for the sake of illustration, I've never actually touched a brain, so I don't know exactly what their properties are, but I assume they're warm and squishy. But I don't know, maybe they're not. I have no idea, right? But let's assume the brain is warm and squishy. If the brain were the mind, or if the brain were the bodily organ of the mind, the brain, being warm and squishy, would resist certain forms. Certain forms couldn't be imprinted upon it, so to speak. And so we would be incapable of thinking about certain things, namely those forms that the brain would resist. And being warm and squishy, Aristotle's idea seems to be the brain would resist forms such as cold and hard, the opposites of the properties that the organ has. And so, if the brain were the mind, or if the brain were the bodily organ of the mind, we wouldn't be able to think about icicles, say, or things that are cold and hard. That seems to be Aristotle's idea. That seems to be what he's claiming. Now, so there are two kind of crucial ideas that are driving this argument. One of them is this thing that I've highlighted as the crucial fact. The mind can think about anything, can potentially think about anything. But the other one is this fact. The other crucial fact is, or crucial claim, I should say, is Aristotle's idea that in thinking, the mind becomes the form. And since the mind can think about anything and so can take on any form, it needs to be suitably prepared to take on any form. And that means, according to Aristotle, that it can have no nature of its own. It can't be a body, it can't be warm and squishy. Now, what Aristotle emphasizes throughout this discussion is that what he's talking about is the passive intellect or the potential intellect. You can even see that word cropping up in what we've seen: potential, potentiality. The mind can be potentially any form. The mind is receptive of all forms. And because the mind is receptive of all forms, and so we can think about anything, the mind can't be an organ or something like that. If it were an organ, it couldn't receive all forms. That seems to be Aristotle's main idea here. And so the mind is not an organ. Okay. Well, what's the upshot of that? The upshot is that the mind is, in principle, separable from the body. This part of the soul is, in principle, separable from the body. It could, in other words, it's possible, in other words, for this part of the mind, the rational part, to exist without a body. That is, in principle, possible. Does it actually happen? For example, when we die, do our minds live on? This is one of the most controversial parts of Aristotelian scholarship. I think the conclusion that scholars have come to is that it's unclear what Aristotle thinks about that. It's possible because the mind is in principle separable from the body. It's unclear whether Aristotle thought the mind actually survived the body's death, though. All right, so that's the passive intellect. And we're going to return to some of these ideas in just a second. The passive intellect, what Aristotle is stressing, is the potential for the mind to think about anything. The mind can potentially become anything. It can acquire any form. Well, when you have a potential, there needs to be something that actualizes it, right? So when you have a pile of bricks and floor joists and windows and whatever, right? The matter of a house, that thing is potentially a house. In order to become an actual house, there needs to be some sort of agent that actualizes that potential, that puts the form into that potential, that turns that potential into actuality. And so, what we've talked about so far is the mind is potentially any form. What is it that makes it actually a form? What is it that actually initiates thought? That's the active intellect. So the mind, the passive intellect, is receptive to any forms. How do those forms actually get there? That's what the active intellect does. And this is what Aristotle describes in 3.5. So the active intellect, this aspect or part of the mind, puts these intelligible forms into our minds. So when you have your frog scientist, prior to doing their PhD in frog science, their mind could potentially think about the form of frogs. The form of frogs, the very thing that's animating Kermit out there, could come to be in this person's mind. But they haven't studied yet. They need to go through 10 years of frog school. And then eventually they're able to think about the form of frog, right? The intelligible form of frog is present in their minds. They understand the nature and essence of frogs. Well, what capacity of the mind, what part of the mind puts that form or is responsible for kind of distilling the intelligible form of frog from all of the information that they get? That's the active intellect, right? Something like that is Aristotle's idea. And then in 3.5, in a very short discussion, very terse discussion, Aristotle goes on to basically just assert certain things about the active intellect. And book 3, chapter 5 is one of the most written about passages in the entire Aristotelian corpus. One of the reasons it's written about so much is it's very suggestive and very, what's the word? He's not entirely clear. He doesn't really pin anything down. It's not entirely clear what he's saying. And I got these things out of order. So the active intellect, according to Aristotle, is essentially thinking. And really what he's getting at here is the active intellect is actually thinking about these forms. The potential intellect, what we have in our minds, right, could potentially think about certain forms. The active intellect is actually considering forms. Aristotle draws an analogy. He says the active intellect is like light. And this should bring to mind, for those, since we've read it, Plato's image of the sun. Aristotle's idea here seems to be very similar to one of Plato's ideas there. And if you recall, what Plato says there is if you have somebody with the power of sight and you have a visible object, you're not going to get sight. You need some sort of medium. You need light. And then when you have light, that will make knowable objects actually, or that'll make visible objects actually seen by the eyes or whatever. And then Plato applies that in the intelligible case. Well, Aristotle is doing something very similar, again, for the intelligible case, for knowing, for our minds. He's saying that the active intellect is something like this intelligible light. It makes knowable objects known, right? And so the knowable object is what kind of puts these forms into our minds in the way that light puts visible objects into our eyes. That's what the active intellect does, according to Aristotle. So it's similar to Plato's form of the good. Aristotle continues, the active intellect, much like the passive intellect, is separable and unmixed. It can exist apart from any body. It's not mixed with a body, right? It doesn't have an organ. And lastly, he claims that it's immortal and eternal. It has always existed and it will always exist. And that's pretty much all Aristotle says about it. Moving on, he moves on to other things. And so that immediately, it's very suggestive and it's not entirely clear what he's talking about. And the major ambiguity is the following. Is the active intellect a kind of part of our own minds? If it is, well, then this part of our minds would seem to be immortal and eternal. And so Aristotle would be committed to saying that in some sense, our minds, at least this active intellect part of our minds, has always existed and will always exist. And so, yes, we would survive our bodily death. Or is the active intellect not a part of us at all, but rather external to us? Is it something like some sort of divine figure, like God? And God kind of enlightens our mind and helps put forms in our minds. And so, yeah, God is immortal and eternal. That's not, and God doesn't have a body and so on. That's fine. It's unclear what Aristotle thinks. Is the active intellect simply a kind of divine part of us, or is it actually just God? Unclear what Aristotle thinks. We're going to see more of what Aristotle thinks about God, not next week, but the week after. But the important point that I want to emphasize now is simply that in principle, it's possible for the mind to exist without a body. Whether it actually does in our own case, it's unclear from Aristotle. It's unclear what Aristotle thinks. But in principle, it's possible because the mind does not have a bodily organ.